The first sign that I was no longer welcome in my own family came on a Tuesday morning, written in neat black ink at the bottom of a legal envelope that wasn't addressed to me but was very much about me. I found it by accident. Or maybe accidents are just what we call truths that show up before we're ready. I was 32 years old, standing barefoot in my kitchen in Asheville, North Carolina. Coffee going cold on the counter when my phone buzzed with a text from my younger sister. "Don't come early on Friday. We need family-only time before the ceremony." The quotation marks around family only were hers. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, waiting for a follow-up that never came. No explanation, no heart emoji, no love you. Just a boundary drawn quietly like a door closing without a slam. 3 days later, I would understand exactly what she meant. But that morning, I still believed the lie I had been telling myself for years, that tension was temporary, that love outweighed favoritism, that silence was the same thing as peace. I rinsed my mug, slipped on my shoes, and drove to the office like nothing had shifted. That was my habit. When something felt wrong, I kept moving. I had learned early that if you pause too long in a family like mine, someone else decides what happens next. I worked as an operations director for a mid-sized logistics firm, a role I had built slowly, brick by brick, after walking away from the family business at 26. Not because I wanted to, but because I had been told gently and repeatedly that my presence complicated things. My father, Martin Hale, had started Hale & Sons Construction 40 years earlier with nothing but a pickup truck and a handshake agreement from a local developer. By the time he passed, the company owned equipment yards across 3 counties and employed over 100 people. And yet, when it came time to talk about succession, my name never came up. Not because I wasn't qualified. I had an MBA. I had worked summers on job sites, knew how to read contracts, balance bids, manage crews. I knew the business inside out. But I was the wrong child. My brother Evan was the golden one. Charismatic, risk-taking, loud in rooms where I preferred to listen. My sister Claire, the youngest, was the favorite. Soft-spoken, emotional, always protected. I was the middle, the capable one. The one who could be trusted to handle things without needing recognition. At least that's what they said. By noon that day, I was deep into spreadsheets when my assistant poked her head into my office. "Lauren, there's a courier here. Says he needs a signature." I frowned. "For me?" She nodded. "Personal delivery." The envelope was thick, cream-colored, heavy paper, the kind people use when they want to look official without being kind. My name wasn't on the front. My father's was. "Estate of Artin Hales." My stomach tightened, but I kept my face neutral as I signed and carried it back to my desk. I didn't open it right away. I lined it up neatly beside my keyboard, answered 3 emails, returned a call. Delay is another habit. When I finally slid my finger under the seal, the first thing I saw was the letterhead of a law firm I recognized. Whitmore and Calhoun, estate send attorneys, expensive ones. I skimmed until a sentence stopped me cold. "Per the amended will dated June 14th, the following distributions shall be executed." Amended. My father had died 11 months earlier. June 14th was 3 weeks before his heart attack. My name appeared exactly once. Not as a beneficiary, as a witness. I felt the room tilt slightly like a building settling after a structural shift. Not collapsing, just realigning. The document was precise, calm, cold. Evan inherited controlling interest in the company. Claire received the lake house outright. My mother, still living, retained her residence and a monthly stipend. And I was left a personal item of sentimental value to be determined at the executor's discretion. No mention of the years I spent keeping the books clean when Evan overextended. No mention of the nights I slept on job site trailers to meet deadlines. No explanation. Just exclusion. I sat there reading the page again and again, waiting for anger, waiting for tears, waiting for something dramatic. Nothing came. What came instead was a memory I hadn't thought about in years. Christmas dinner 5 years earlier. My father had raised a glass and said, "Lauren doesn't need this business. She's always been independent." Everyone laughed. I had smiled. I folded the papers carefully, slid them back into the envelope, and placed it in my drawer. Then I did something unexpected. I closed my laptop. I walked out of the office early, and I didn't tell anyone where I was going. That evening, I drove the 2 hours to my parents' house, the one my mother still lived in, tucked behind old maple trees and a gravel driveway that never quite stayed level. I didn't call ahead. I didn't rehearse a speech. When I knocked, my mother answered with surprise that didn't quite reach concern. "Oh," she said, "you're here." I stepped inside, the familiar smell of lemon cleaner and old wood wrapping around me. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had done homework, signed loan papers, eaten quiet meals while everyone else talked over me. I placed the envelope between us. "Did you know about this?" I asked. She didn't open it. She didn't pretend not to understand. She just sighed. "Your father thought it would be easier this way." Easier for who? For the family. There it was, the word they used like a shield. I nodded slowly. "And Claire's wedding?" She hesitated. "Just a beat too long. Your sister is under a lot of stress." I stood up. "I won't be there on Friday," I said. Her head snapped up. Lauren, I won't make it harder, I continued. I never do. I walked out before she could stop me. That night, alone in my apartment, I realized something with a clarity that felt almost peaceful. I hadn't been written out of a will. I had been written out of a story. And for the first time in my life, I understood that silence wasn't neutral. It was consent. By the end of that week, I would stop giving it. By Friday morning, my absence had already been decided for me. I woke up before my alarm. The room still dark, the city quiet in that way it only is before people start pretending everything is fine. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing, and realized something unsettling. I didn't feel sad. Not the way I was supposed to. There was no dramatic grief, no aching nostalgia, no urge to call anyone and beg for clarity. What I felt was distance. Clean, sharp, like stepping back from a painting and finally seeing what the picture actually was. Claire's wedding was scheduled for noon in Greenville, South Carolina. I had already taken the day off months ago. Bought a dress, booked a hotel, rearranged meetings. All of it now felt like evidence from a life that wasn't really mine. At 9:07 a.m., my phone buzzed. Buzzed again. Mom, are you still coming later? Later. Not, are you okay? Not, we need to talk. Later. I didn't reply. Instead, I made coffee, showered, and sat down at my dining table with the envelope from Whitmore and Calhoun spread open in front of me. This time I read it slowly. Not emotionally, structurally, dates, signatures, clauses. And something else I had missed the first time. A reference to an irrevocable trust tied to Hale & Sons construction amended alongside the will. The language was dense, but one phrase stood out. Contingent upon continued executive oversight. Oversight. I pulled my laptop toward me and logged into the cloud folder I still had access to. Evan had never bothered revoking my credentials. He didn't see me as a threat. I was the sister who moved on. What he forgot was that systems remember people longer than families do. The trust documents were there, buried under scanned contracts and financial projections. I opened them one by one, following the paper trail backward the way my father taught me when numbers didn't add up. And then I saw it. My name? Not as a beneficiary, as a guarantor. 5 years earlier, when Hale & Sons expanded into commercial projects, the bank had required a secondary guarantor with no equity but high liquidity. Someone stable, conservative, predictable. Evan had been leveraged to the edge. Claire had nothing to offer, so they came to me. I remembered the meeting now. The way Dad had framed it as a formality. The way Mom brought cookies like it was a family dinner. The way Evan joked that it was just paperwork. I had signed because I trusted them. Because I was family. Because no one said the word replacement out loud. I leaned back in my chair, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the room. If I was still a guarantor, then my exclusion wasn't just emotional. It was strategic. They had cut me out of the story, but left me holding the risk. At 10:32 a.m., my behind rung. Evan. I watched it buzz until it stopped. Then again, I answered on the third try. Hey, he said, his voice light rushed. Where are you? Home. Pause. You're not on the road. No. Another pause, longer this time. Lauren, today isn't about you. I almost smiled. I know, I said calmly. It never is. He exhaled sharply. Claire's upset. Mom's asking questions. People are noticing. I was told not to come early. That was about logistics. Was it? Silence stretched between us. I could picture him, phone pressed to his ear, jaw tight, scanning a room full of people he needed to impress. You're making this bigger than it needs to be, he said. No, I replied. I'm finally seeing it for what it is. His tone hardened. Are you threatening something? I looked down at the trust documents on my screen. No, I said. I don't need to. I hung up. At noon, while Claire walked down the aisle, surrounded by white roses and curated smiles, I was sitting in a quiet conference room at the office of a corporate attorney named Denise Carter. I hadn't planned the meeting, but Denise had been my lawyer once before when I negotiated my exit package from Hale & Sons. She knew the family. She knew the patterns. She read the documents without interruption, her pen tapping softly against the table. When she finished, she looked up at me. They can't have it both ways, she said. Explain. They can't exclude you from the estate while keeping you financially liable for the company. That trust was built on your continued consent. I folded my hands. What happens if I withdraw it? The bank reviews the risk profile, she said, immediately. And if they don't like what they see, they'll call in protections, audits, covenants, maybe more. I nodded once. Do I have to explain myself? Denise shook her head. No, you just have to sign. I stared at the blank space on the page where my name would go. For years, I had believed that not rocking the boat made me safe. What it really did was make me useful. At 1:17 p.m., I signed the withdrawal. No speech, no warning, no message to my family. Just ink on paper. By the time Claire said I do Hale & Sons construction was officially under financial review. At 2:03 p.m., my phone exploded with missed calls. Mom, Evan, an unknown number I recognized as the company's CFO. I turned my phone face down. That evening, I walked through my apartment as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the floor. I packed the dress I hadn't worn into the back of my closet. I placed the wedding gift I'd bought back into its box. I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching traffic move without urgency. For the first time since my father died, I felt something shift. Not anger, not revenge, control. And somewhere in Greenville, as champagne glasses clinked and speeches began, my family was starting to realize that the sister they had written out was still very much part of the ending. They just didn't know yet how much it was going to cost them. The first voicemail came in at 6:14 a.m. the next morning. It wasn't angry, that came later. It was confused. Lauren Evans said, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. The bank flagged something overnight. They're asking questions. Did you do something? I deleted it without replying. By 8:30, my inbox was full. Subject lines carefully worded to sound neutral, professional, non-accusatory. Request for clarification, urgent guarantor documentation, re-amended trust agreement. They all circled the same truth without touching it. The system had noticed I was gone. At 9:00 a.m., Denise called. They've already scheduled a preliminary audit, she said. That was fast. I pictured Evan pasting his office, sleeves rolled up, trying to charm numbers that no longer wanted to be charmed. Is that bad? I asked. It's not good, she said evenly. But what matters is what they find. And what will they find? She paused. That your brother has been floating expenses between subsidiaries. That cash flow projections were optimistic. That risk was being offset by your guarantee. My silence stretched long enough for her to add, You didn't cause this, Lauren. You just stopped absorbing it. That afternoon, I returned to work like it was any other day. I sat through meetings, reviewed performance metrics, approved a hiring request. No one there knew what had shifted in my personal life, and I didn't need them to. At 3:47 p.m., my phone banged and again. Claire this time. I let it ring. Then again. On the third call, I answered. Where are you? She demanded, skipping any attempt at softness. At work. You missed my wedding. Yes! A sharp inhale. Do you have any idea how that looked? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. You told me not to come early. That wasn't... She stopped, recalibrated. Mom's devastated. I'm sure she is. And now Evan says the company is in trouble. I closed my eyes. There it was. Not concern for me, not curiosity, just consequence. Is it? I asked. Don't play dumb, Claire snapped. You're the only one who would do something like this. You always need to prove a point. I smiled faintly. No, Claire, I needed to stop being one. Her voice dropped sharp with accusation. Dad would be furious. Dad amended his will in secret, I replied calmly. Let's not pretend he was worried about my feelings. She went quiet. When she spoke again, her tone had changed. We're family, she said. You don't do this to family. I thought of the envelope, the witness line, the way my name had been used without being honored. I didn't, I said. I stopped doing something for family. That night, my mother showed up at my apartment unannounced. She stood in the doorway, coat still, on eyes rimmed red, clutching her purse like it might float away. You embarrassed us, she said, instead of hello. I stepped aside and let her in. We sat at opposite ends of the couch, the space between us heavy with years of things never said. Your brother is under enormous pressure, she continued. The timing of this couldn't be worse. I nodded. I imagine it's uncomfortable. She stared at me. How can you be so cold? I met her gaze. How can you be so surprised? Her mouth opened, then closed. You've always been strong, she said finally. We thought you could handle it. That's not love, I said quietly. That's delegation. She shook her head, frustrated. You're blowing this out of proportion? I stood and walked to the bookshelf, pulling out a thin binder I had kept without knowing why. Old copies of contracts, emails, memos. I handed it to her. She flipped through it slowly, her expression changing with each page. Do you know, I said that my signature kept that company solvent through 2 expansions. She didn't answer. Do you know that I was never told the trust could be amended without my consent? Still nothing. And do you know, I continued, that the only reason the bank hasn't pulled the line of credit entirely is because they're still deciding how exposed Evan is. Her hands trembled slightly as she closed the binder. This will destroy him, she whispered. I sat back down. No, it will reveal him. She looked at me like she was seeing a stranger. You could fix this, she said. You could sign back on. Quietly. No one needs to know. I shook my head once. That's over. She stood abruptly. So that's it. You're just walking away. I thought of all the years I had stayed, of the way walking away had always been my fear. I already did, I said. I'm just the last one to admit it. 2 days later, the audit findings leaked. Asset. Nothing dramatic, no headlines, just quiet shifts. A delayed vendor payment, a paused expansion project, a bank request for additional collateral. The kind of problems that don't explode, but slowly suffocate. Evan called again. This time his voice wasn't angry or confused. It was careful. We should talk, he said. In person. I agreed. We met at a neutral place. A diner halfway between our homes, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that never tasted fresh. He looked older, tired. You didn't have to do this, he said. Yes, I replied, I did. He leaned forward. What do you want? The question hung between us, raw and revealing. I realized then that this was how he had always seen me. Not as a sister, as leverage. I want my name removed from every obligation tied to that company, I said. I want acknowledgement of my contribution, and I want it documented. His jaw tightened. That would spook the board. I know. And if I refuse? I met his eyes calm. Then the bank finishes what it started. Silence. He exhaled slowly. You've changed. No, I said. I stopped compensating. He looked down at his hands. For the first time, there was no argument ready. I need time, he muttered. You've had years, I replied. You have until Friday. As I left the diner, the sky was heavy with clouds, the air thick with the promise of rain. I felt lighter than I had in a long time. Not because I was winning, but because I was no longer losing myself to keep others comfortable. By Friday, Evan would make his choice. And either way, I would finally be free of the role my family had assigned me without ever asking if I wanted it. Friday came without drama. No storm, no slammed doors, no last-minute apologies. Just a quiet morning and a missed deadline. Evan didn't call. By noon, Denise forwarded me a short email from Whitmore and Calhoun, carefully phrased, legally, polite. Mr. Hale has declined to execute the requested amendments at this time. I read it once, then again, feeling nothing more than confirmation. When people show you where you rank, believing them is not cruelty, it's clarity. I replied with a single line. Proceed accordingly. Denise called within minutes. Once this moves forward, she said there's no soft landing. The bank will escalate. I understand. They may freeze operating credit. Vendors could walk. The board may step in. I understand, I repeated. I'm not asking you to punish him. I'm asking you to protect me. A pause. That's already happening. The bank didn't announce its next move. Institutions rarely do. They simply tighten. By Monday morning, Hale & Son's primary line of credit was suspended pending full review. Payroll still went out, but just barely. Equipment leases were flagged. A long-planned acquisition quietly disappeared from the agenda. None of it made the news, but everyone inside the company felt it. Evan showed up at my apartment that evening. This time he didn't knock. He stood there long enough for me to notice through the peephole. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, strategically. I opened the door. He didn't step inside. Please, he said. Not dramatically, just flat. We need to talk. We sat at my kitchen table, the same place where I had first read the will. I poured water. He declined. You blindsided me, he said. No, I replied. You assumed I wouldn't move. His jaw tightened. You're destroying Dad's legacy. I held his gaze. Dad's legacy isn't a balance sheet. It's how he treated his children. And if we're being honest, he started this. That's not fair. Neither is being used as a financial buffer while being written out of the future, I said evenly. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. The board is asking questions. The bank wants a restructuring plan. Mom's furious. I nodded. She came by. He looked up sharply. She did? Yes. She asked me to fix it quietly. And I said no. Silence fell between us. You know, he said finally, you could have just asked for recognition. I laughed once, short and humorless. I did. For years. You just learned how to hear me when it started costing you. His shoulders slumped slightly. What do you want now? He asked again. The question sounded different this time. Less transactional. More desperate. I want a clean exit, I said. From the trust, from the guarantees, from any legal or financial entanglement with that company. And then what? Then you run it without my shadow propping it up. He stared at the table. That might kill it. Or force it to become honest, I replied. Either way, it won't be my responsibility. He looked up, anger flashing briefly before exhaustion smothered it. You've always been like this, he said. Cold, calculated. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. No, I said quietly. I've always been observant. You just preferred me silent. He didn't respond. He left 20 minutes later without shaking my hand. The next escalation came from a place I hadn't expected. My grandmother, Evelyn Hale, was 84 years old, sharp as broken glass, and had never liked surprises. She called me the following afternoon. I hear you're causing trouble, she said without preamble. I hear I'm setting boundaries, I replied. A pause, then a dry chuckle. Your father always said you'd be the one who didn't blink. I closed my eyes. Did he? Yes, she said. And then he spent a lifetime pretending that scared him. She invited me to her house the next day. I almost declined, but something in her tone told me this wasn't about guilt or pressure. It was about information. Her house sat at the edge of town, old money quiet, lined with framed black and white photos that told a story my father had never fully explained. She poured tea and gestured for me to sit. Do you know why your father changed his will? She asked. I assume control. Fear, she corrected. He was sick longer than he told anyone. And Evan convinced him that dividing power would fracture the company. I nodded. That sounds like Evan. She studied me. Do you know who argued against it? I looked up. You, she said. You weren't there, but he talked about you constantly, about how you wouldn't approve, about how you'd walk. My chest tightened slightly. He said you'd choose dignity over inheritance, she continued. He wasn't wrong. So why do it? She smiled sadly. Because men like your father believe legacy is something you leave behind, not something you protect while you're still here. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside was a handwritten note, dated 2 days before my father's heart attack. It wasn't addressed to me, but it mentioned me by name. Lauren will understand it read. She always does. I felt something shift, not forgiveness, not relief. Context. My grandmother leaned forward. Your father made mistakes. Your brother exploited them. Your mother avoided them. But you, she said quietly, are the only one telling the truth. She closed the folder. Whatever happens next, don't let them make you feel cruel for refusing to be consumed. When I left her house, the sun was setting low, the sky streaked with muted gold. My phone buzzed as I reached my car. A text from Denise. The board has scheduled an emergency session. They want you present. I stared at the message. For the first time, they weren't calling me to fix something quietly. They were calling because the structure was shaking, and they were finally ready to acknowledge who had been holding it up all along. I typed back 2 words. I'll attend. As I drove away, I realized something with a clarity that felt almost serene. This wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. And the people who had mistaken my silence for compliance were about to learn the difference. The boardroom was colder than I remembered. Same long walnut table. Same city view through floor-to-ceiling glass. Same framed mission statement on the wall that no one had ever questioned out loud. Integrity, accountability, legacy. I arrived 10 minutes early. Not out of politeness, but habit. When you grow up being the one expected to stabilize everything, punctuality becomes a form of armor. Evan arrived last. He didn't look at me when he sat down. The board members shifted in their seats as I entered, a few nodding, politely others avoiding eye contact. These were people who had known me for years. Some had watched me grow up. Some had signed off on decisions I had quietly shaped from the margins. And yet, this was the first time I had been invited into this room without a crisis attached to my name. The chair cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming on short notice, he said. We're here to discuss the recent developments affecting Hale & Sons construction. Recent developments. I folded my hands in my lap. The CFO began with numbers, tight margins, increased scrutiny, a bank review that had escalated from precaution to concern. No one said my name. Then Denise spoke, not as my lawyer, as counsel to the board. The trust amendment executed last year was contingent on the continued consent of all guarantors, she said calmly. That consent has been withdrawn? Legally? Cleanly? A murmur moved through the room. One of the older board members leaned forward. Are you saying this could have been avoided? Denise didn't hesitate. Yes, if Ms. Hale's role and exposure had been addressed transparently. All eyes turned to me, not accusatory, assessing. I met their gaze without flinching. I want to be clear, I said. I didn't act out of spite. I acted out of self-preservation. Evan shifted beside me, his jaw tight. For years I continued. I was asked to support this company without authority, visibility, or protection. When the estate was amended, I understood exactly where I stood. I paused, letting the silence work. I chose to step away before that position became catastrophic. The chair nodded slowly. You're saying you were exposed without recourse? Yes, I replied, and quietly expected to accept it. Another board member spoke up. Why now? I looked at Evan then, just briefly. Because exclusion removes obligation, I said. You can't benefit from someone's stability while denying them standing. No one interrupted. The chair exhaled. What are you asking for? The question echoed. I didn't rush. I want my name removed from all current and future financial guarantees, I said. I want written acknowledgement of my past role in risk mitigation. And I want a clean separation from Hale & Sons. A pause. And if we can't agree, someone asked. I leaned back slightly. Then the bank proceeds without my buffer, and the company adapts accordingly. That was the moment. Not explosive, not dramatic. Just acceptance, settling into the room like gravity. Evan finally spoke. You're willing to let this place burn, he said quietly. I turned to him fully now. No, I said. I'm willing to stop holding it together alone. The chair rubbed his chin. Ms. Hale, if we meet your terms, will you support a transition period? I considered it. Not emotionally. Strategically. Yes, I said. 30 days. Limited. Documented. Evan's head snapped toward me. You'd still help. I met his eyes. I'll finish what I started, I said. I won't stay where I'm invisible. The meeting adjourned 2 hours later. No hugs, no apologies. Just signatures scheduled, terms outlined, reality acknowledged. As I walked out, one of the board members caught up to me. I always wondered, he said quietly, how this place stayed solvent during the rough years. I smiled faintly. So did I. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment shoes, kicked off paperwork spread across the table. For the first time, my exit wasn't framed as abandonment. It was structured, respected, real. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "We need to talk. You've gone too far." I stared at it for a long moment. Then I typed back. "I didn't go far enough for a long time. I'm done explaining." I set the phone down and poured myself a glass of wine. Outside the city hummed on, indifferent and steady. Inside me, something finally settled. I wasn't fixing the family anymore. I was fixing myself. And the cost of that decision was no longer mine to carry alone. The next morning, I woke up to quiet. Not the empty kind that presses on your ears, but the rare kind that feels earned. The kind that follows a decision that cannot be undone and no longer needs defending. For the first time in weeks, my phone didn't light up with missed calls or carefully worded messages pretending to be concerned. The world hadn't ended, it had simply adjusted. I spent the morning reviewing the transition documents Denise had sent overnight. Clean language, precise timelines, no emotional padding, 30 days. After that, Hale & Sons would no longer have any legal tether to me. No guarantees, no signatures hidden in footnotes, no late-night calls asking me to just look something over. At noon, Evan showed up again. This time he texted first. "Can we talk? Not about the company." I hesitated, then replied, 15 minutes, my place. He arrived looking like someone who hadn't slept well. His confidence was still there, but it sat differently now, like a jacket he hadn't tailored to this version of himself yet. We didn't sit. He paced. I didn't realize he said finally how much you were carrying. I crossed my arms, leaning against the counter. "You didn't ask. I assumed you would tell me if it was too much." I tilted my head slightly. "You assumed I would absorb it." He stopped pacing. "That's not fair." "It's accurate," I said calmly. He ran a hand through his hair. "Do you know what this is doing to Mom?" I exhaled slowly. "Evan, I'm not her emotional shock absorber either." He flinched. "You think this is easy for me," he snapped. "The board's watching me. The bank doesn't trust me. People are whispering." I met his gaze. "Welcome to accountability." The word landed hard between us. He looked away. "I didn't mean to push you out." "No," I said. "You just never pulled me in." Silence stretched. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. "If things had been different, would you have stayed?" I considered it. "Yes," I said honestly. "If I had been seen." He nodded slowly, like someone filing away a truth too late to use it. Before he left, he hesitated at the door. "You know, he said Claire hasn't spoken to anyone since the wedding. She thinks you ruined everything." I felt something tighten briefly. Not guilt, recognition. "Claire built everything on approval," I replied. "That kind of structure collapses easily." That afternoon, I met with Denise again to finalize the acknowledgement language. It wasn't about ego, it was about record. History is written by whoever documents it first. The acknowledgement stated in clear legal terms that my financial guarantees had stabilized the company during 2 expansion cycles and mitigated risk exposure during volatile periods. No adjectives, no praise, just fact. Denise slid the final draft across the table. Once this is filed, it becomes part of the permanent corporate record. I signed without ceremony. On my way home, my phone buzzed with a new email. From Claire. Subject: "You need to fix this." I didn't open it. Some messages lose power when you stop responding. That evening, I went for a walk through my neighborhood, the air cool, the sky fading into soft indigo. Couples passed me. Dogs tugged on leashes. Someone laughed loudly from an open window. Life unbothered by my family drama. And for the first time, I let myself imagine a future that wasn't built around reaction. I had spent so long being the contingency plan that I'd never asked what I wanted when nothing was on fire. 2 days later, the retaliation began. It didn't come from Evan. It came from my mother. She sent a group email addressed to me, Evan, Claire, and copied to my grandmother. It was long, emotional, carefully curated. She wrote about sacrifice, about how families survive by bending, about how my actions had fractured something sacred. She wrote that she didn't recognize me anymore. She wrote that she hoped one day I would understand the damage I had caused. I read it once, then I forwarded it to Denise, with one line of instruction: archive. No response. That was the moment I understood something important. Manipulation often wears the language of love, but love doesn't demand self-erasure. By the end of the week, the company's internal restructuring was public knowledge. Not scandal, just reality. Evan was still in charge, but now under scrutiny. The board had hired an external advisor, controls tightened, transparency demanded. The buffer was gone. On Sunday morning, I received a call from an unknown number. It was my grandmother. "You did well," she said simply. "I don't feel like I did," I replied. She chuckled softly. "That's because you're used to fixing things, not freeing yourself." She paused. "Your mother will be angry for a while. Your brother will be resentful. Your sister will rewrite the story to survive it." I closed my eyes. "And me. You'll finally hear yourself think," she said. "Don't underestimate that." After we hung up, I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee and watched the city wake up. I realized then that a revenge had never been my goal. Revenge still ties you to the people who hurt you. What I wanted was autonomy, and autonomy doesn't shout. It steps back. It documents. It leaves With the 30-day transition ticking down, the last illusion my family had about my role was starting to fade. And in its place, something quieter but stronger was forming. A life where I didn't have to disappear to be loved, and where being excluded was no longer a threat, but an exit. The 7th day of the transition was the first time I felt the absence. Not the absence of my family. The absence of expectation. No one needed me to fix anything that morning. No calls. No urgent emails. No quiet panic disguised as politeness. I woke up, made coffee, and realized I had nowhere I was required to be. It felt unfamiliar, almost irresponsible. I used the time to go through old files I had brought home from Hale & Sons years ago. Not out of nostalgia, but inventory. When you exit something cleanly, you don't carry ghosts with you. There were notebooks filled with timelines and contingency plans. Handwritten notes from meetings where my name never appeared in the minutes. Emails where I was CC'd only after decisions were made, asked to review what had already been finalized. Evidence of a role that existed only when something went wrong. At noon, Denise called. "They're complying," she said. "Slowly, but they are." "That surprises me," I replied. "It shouldn't," she said. "They didn't think you'd follow through. Now they're recalibrating." Recalibrating, another polite word for panic. That afternoon, I drove out to my grandmother's house again. She hadn't asked me to come. I hadn't told her I was, but something in me needed to see the place where truth was still spoken plainly. She was in the garden when I arrived, kneeling in the dirt, with gloves on hair pinned back, completely unbothered by her age. "You look lighter," she said without looking up. "I am," I replied. She stood slowly brushing soil from her hands. "Good, it suits you." We sat on the back porch with iced tea, the kind she always made too strong. "Your mother called," she said casually. I nodded. I assumed. "She's convinced you've been influenced. By lawyers, by bitterness, by modern ideas." I smiled faintly. "Of course she is. My grandmother studied me." "Do you know what scares people like your mother most?" "Loss of control," I said. "No," she corrected gently. "Loss of narrative." She leaned back. "She needs to believe she raised a family that stayed in line. Your refusal threatens the story she tells herself." That landed quietly but firmly. As I left, she said one more thing. "Lauren, don't rush to rebuild bridges that were designed to collapse under your weight." On day 10, the board sent a formal acknowledgement. Signed, filed, permanent. My name appeared exactly where it should have years earlier. Not praised, recognized. I didn't celebrate. I didn't forward it to anyone. I saved it to my records and closed the file. That evening, Claire showed up. Unannounced, uninvited, familiar. She stood in my doorway wearing the same coat she'd worn to brunches we used to attend before everything became a performance. "You look fine," she said, like it was an accusation. "So do you," I replied. We sat at the table. She didn't wait for tea. I lost everything she said abruptly. I raised an eyebrow. "You had a wedding, not a life." Her eyes flashed. "You know what I mean." I let the silence stretch until she filled it. "People are talking," she continued. "Caleb's family won't return calls. Mom barely leaves the house. Evan's drowning. And you," I asked. She swallowed. "I don't know who I am if I'm not the one everyone approves of." There it was, the truth she had been circling her whole life. "You could start by not blaming me," I said. Her voice rose. "You didn't have to humiliate us." "I didn't," I replied evenly. I stepped away. She slammed her hand on the table. "You always do this. You leave and pretend it's strength." I leaned forward slightly. "And you stay and call it loyalty." She froze. "That's not the same thing," I continued. "You stayed quiet while they erased me. You stayed smiling while they used me. That wasn't loyalty. That was compliance." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I needed you," she said softly. I believed her. That was the tragedy of it. "You needed the version of me who would disappear for your comfort," I said. "That version doesn't exist anymore." She stood abruptly. "You think you're better than us now," she said. "No," I replied. "I think I'm done being smaller." She left without another word. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. No dreams, no rehearsed conversations, just rest. By day 15, the bank review concluded. No collapse, no miracle recovery. Just conditions. Evan would remain, but under oversight. The board would remain, but alert. The company would survive, but changed. Without me. And that was fine. I met Evan one last time at the office to hand over the final transition binder. Our conversation was brief, professional. At the door, he hesitated. "You know," he said quietly, "Dad would have hated how this turned out." I met his eyes. "Dad hated conflict," I said. "He loved comfort more than fairness." Evan flinched, but didn't argue. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I didn't look back. There was nothing left to prove. The truth doesn't need witnesses when it's already been documented. And for the first time since my father died, my life wasn't organized around someone else's silence. It was organized around my own. And that I realized was the real turning point. Not the audit, not the wedding, not the will. The moment I stopped negotiating my worth, and the story finally began to move somewhere else. After I left Hale & Sons for the last time, the quiet followed me longer than I expected. Not immediately. At At first, it felt like relief dressed up as freedom. I slept later. I walked slower. I stopped checking my phone every few minutes as if someone might need rescuing. But underneath that calm was something else, something less comfortable. A question I had never allowed myself to ask. Who am I when no one is pulling at me? The first week after the transition ended, I kept my schedule full on purpose. Meetings with recruiters, coffee with former colleagues, long lunches that went nowhere. I told myself I was being proactive, but the truth was simpler. Stillness scared me. On Wednesday afternoon, I sat across from a senior partner at a consulting firm who flipped through my resume with interest that felt practiced. You have an unusual background, he said. Operational, financial, legal exposure, family business. I nodded. Yes. He smiled knowingly. Those environments teach resilience. They also teach silence, I thought, but didn't say. He outlined a role. High pay, heavy travel, crisis management, fixing other people's messes in polished boardrooms. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'll think about it, I said. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I needed to hear my own thoughts without interruption. Somewhere between a red light and a gas station, it hit me. Every opportunity being offered to me was a variation of the same role. Containment. I was valuable because I absorbed pressure well, because I didn't break publicly, because I made other people look competent. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot and sat there longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel. I didn't leave my family just to recreate them somewhere else. That night, my mother called again. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was softer this time. Tired, carefully restrained. Lauren, I don't understand why you're doing this to us. I keep replaying everything, wondering where I failed. Please call me. I deleted it. Not because I didn't care, but because her pain was still framed as my responsibility. 2 days later, I got an email from the bank. Not Hale & Sons Bank. Mine. It was a routine notice, the kind most people skim. But one line caught my attention. A reminder about an inactive trust account opened in my name. Inactive. I frowned and logged in. The account had been set up years ago, quietly with a modest balance that had grown steadily. I recognized the date. It was the same year my father asked me to sign as guarantor. Back then, I assumed it was part of some tax strategy. He had told me it was just a formality. I hadn't asked questions. Now I requested the full documentation. What came back made me sit down. The trust wasn't tied to Hale & Sons. It was separate, fully mine, funded annually discreetly from my father's personal dividends. The memo line on each transfer was identical. For Lauren, in case. In case. The words hollowed something out in my chest. He had known. Known he was asking too much. Known the arrangement wasn't fair. Known on some level that I would be the one left standing when things fell apart. And instead of protecting me openly, he had hedged. Quietly. Cowardly, maybe. But intentionally. I didn't cry. I felt something colder and clearer than grief. Understanding. This wasn't absolution. It didn't rewrite the will or undo the damage, but it reframed the past. My father hadn't trusted Evan to hold everything. He had trusted me to survive it. I closed the laptop and stared out the window as dusk settled in. For years, I had believed my exclusion meant I wasn't chosen. The truth was more complicated. I had been chosen for endurance, not inheritance. And that choice had cost me more than he ever acknowledged. The next morning, I called Denise. I need advice, I said, not about the company. She listened as I explained the trust. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. This gives you options, she said finally. I don't want leverage, I replied. I want direction. She smiled in her voice. Then stop thinking like someone who's responding. Start thinking like someone who's building. Later that day, I met with an old contact I hadn't spoken to in years. A woman named Marissa, who had left her family's manufacturing business and started advising women exiting toxic partnerships and companies. Not therapy. Strategy. We sat in a small office that felt lived in, not curated. What do you want? She asked me directly. That isn't a reaction to what you escaped? I opened my mouth, then closed it. I didn't know. She nodded. That's normal. You've been oriented around resistance for too long. She leaned forward. What are you good at that you've never been thanked for? The answer came without effort. Seeing cracks before they become disasters. She smiled. Then build something around prevention, not cleanup. That night, I sketched ideas on paper instead of a screen. Advisory work for founders. Governance structures. Succession planning done ethically, not emotionally. The kind of work that could have saved my family if anyone had wanted saving. By the end of the week, I had declined the consulting firm's offer. They were surprised. I wasn't. On Sunday evening, I received a message from Evan. Short, uncharacteristically honest. The board's bringing in an external COO. I won't fight it. I thought you should know. I stared at the message for a long moment, then replied, That's the right move. No sarcasm, no subtext, just truth. As I set my phone down, I realized something quietly profound. The tables had turned, not because I flipped them, but because I walked away from the game entirely. And for the first time since everything began to unravel, I wasn't bracing for impact. I was choosing direction. The next chapter of my life wasn't going to be about revenge. It was going to be about design, and unlike inheritance, design is something you build deliberately or not at all. The call came on a Monday morning, the kind that doesn't announce itself as important until you hang up and realize something irreversible has just shifted. It was Denise. "I wanted you to hear this from me," she said, "not through anyone else." I was standing in my kitchen barefoot again, the same place where months earlier I'd opened an envelope that quietly erased me. I leaned against the counter and waited. "The estate is being challenged," she continued, formally. I closed my eyes, not in shock, but in recognition. Of course it was. By who, I asked. There was a pause. "Your mother, and Claire." "Not Evan." That mattered. "They're claiming undue influence," Denise said carefully. "Specifically that your father was pressured in his final months and that the amended will doesn't reflect his true intent." I let out a slow breath. "And where do I fit into that story?" "You're being positioned as the destabilizing factor," she replied. "The one who withdrew support. The one who created chaos. The implication is that the will was a reaction to you." I almost laughed. "Almost. So they're rewriting the timeline," I said. "Yes." Silence stretched between us. "Do they have a case?" I asked. Denise didn't answer right away. "Legally, it's thin. Emotionally, they'll try to make it loud." I pictured my mother sitting at her dining table, papers spread out, voice trembling as she told herself this was about fairness. I pictured Claire nodding along, relieved to have a villain that wasn't her own choices. And I realized something with unsettling clarity. This wasn't about money. It was about control, one last attempt to pull me back into orbit. "What do you recommend?" I asked. Denise's voice sharpened, professional and calm. "We respond cleanly. No counterattack, no accusations. Just facts, documentation, and distance." "I can do that," I said. "I know." When the call ended, I stood there for a long moment staring at nothing. I felt the familiar urge rise, the instinct to explain, to soften, to reach out and say, "You don't have to do this." But that instinct had cost me years. I didn't move. That afternoon, I received the official notice. Thick, formal, carefully worded to sound impartial while clearly choosing sides. I forwarded it to Denise. Then I went for a walk, not to escape, but to ground myself. The city was alive in its usual way. People arguing gently on sidewalks, someone dragging a suitcase behind them, a woman laughing into her phone like nothing in the world could touch her. I wondered how many of them were holding invisible battles. How many had learned? Like I had, that adulthood is often just deciding which pain you will no longer accept. 2 days later, Evan called. "I didn't know they were going to do this," he said immediately. I believed him. "I told them it was a mistake," he continued. "I told them to leave it alone." "That must have gone over well," I said. He sighed. "They think they're protecting Dad's legacy." I stopped walking. "No," I said quietly. "They're protecting their version of it." He was silent. "I won't participate," he said finally. "Not against you." That was the first time he had ever chosen a line he didn't benefit from. "I appreciate that," I replied, and I meant it. The first hearing was scheduled quickly. Preliminary, procedural, no decisions, just positioning. I sat in the back of the room, composed, hands folded, while my mother spoke through her attorney about confusion, about grief, about how families fracture when one member acts unilaterally. She didn't look at me. Claire did. Once, briefly. Her expression was tight defensive, as if daring me to react. I didn't. When it was my turn, Denise stood. She spoke about documents, dates, independent counsel, medical records that showed my father was competent when he signed the amendment. She spoke about the separate trust, the one my father funded quietly, in case, she said, repeating the phrase without emphasis. The judge nodded. Nothing dramatic happened. That too was telling. Afterward, in the hallway, my mother approached me. She looked older than I remembered, smaller. "You're really going through with this," she said. "I didn't start it," I replied, "but I won't run from it." Her eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall. "I don't know who you are anymore." I looked at her, truly looked, and saw a woman who had built her sense of safety on predictability, on children who stayed in place, on silence that looked like harmony. "I'm the same person," I said gently. "I just stopped disappearing." She shook her head. "You're tearing us apart." "No," I said. "We were already fractured. I just stopped holding the cracks together." She turned away without another word. That night, I sat at my desk and opened the notebook where I had been sketching ideas for my own work. Advisory frameworks, governance checklists, conversations no one wants to have until it's too late. For the first time, I saw clearly how everything connected. My childhood, the business, the silence, the will, the wedding, all of it was about who gets to decide and who is expected to comply quietly. I wasn't angry anymore. I was resolved. The lawsuit would drag on for months, maybe longer. I knew that. They would test boundaries, push narratives, try to exhaust me back into submission. But something fundamental had changed. I was no longer fighting for a place at a table that had never been built for me. I was building something else entirely. And the more they tried to pull me backward, the clearer my forward direction became. By the end of the week, I signed the paperwork to form my own firm. Nothing flashy, just my name, my terms, my rules. As I closed the folder, I felt a quiet certainty settle in. This wasn't the climax. It was the confirmation. They had made their move, and I hadn't flinched. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to betrayal. I was standing in my own jurisdiction, and whatever came next would happen on ground I finally controlled. The legal process didn't roar forward, it crept. That was its cruelty. Weeks passed with no rulings, no dramatic wins or losses, just filings, extensions, carefully worded letters that arrived in thick envelopes and sat on my desk like objects I no longer feared, but still had to acknowledge. I learned quickly that lawsuits aren't about truth. They're about endurance. My mother's attorney requested additional discovery. Claire submitted a statement filled with emotion and selective memory. They framed my withdrawal from the company as abandonment, as retaliation, as proof that I had always been difficult. The language was subtle but intentional. She was never satisfied. She resented her role. She destabilized the family dynamic. I read it once, then I closed the folder. Denise, steady as ever, handled the responses, each one precise, each one unemotional. Dates, emails, signatures, bank records. Truth does not need adjectives. Meanwhile, my life kept moving. I rented a small office downtown, nothing impressive. One desk, 2 chairs, a window that looked out onto an alley with a mural peeling at the edges. It felt honest, unfinished, like me. I named the firm Hale Advisory Group, not out of loyalty, but reclamation. The name had weight, and it was mine to use. The first client came through Marissa, a woman in her late 40s whose family-owned distribution company was quietly tearing itself apart beneath polite dinners and forced smiles. She sat across from me, hands folded tightly, and said, "I don't want to end up hating my children." I understood that fear intimately. We didn't talk numbers first. We talked boundaries. What decisions belonged to whom? What silence was costing her? What truths had been postponed so long they now felt dangerous? When she left, she looked lighter, not relieved, aware. That became the pattern. I wasn't fixing disasters. I was interrupting them. And every time I helped someone name the moment where love had turned into control, something in me healed quietly. The call from Evan came late one evening. "They've offered mediation," he said. I leaned back in my chair, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. Of course they have. They think if everyone sits in a room, this can be smoothed over. They think silence is the same as peace, I replied. He hesitated. "Would you consider it?" "Yes," I said, on one condition. "What?" "That it's documented. Everything." The mediation was scheduled for early fall. Neutral location, neutral facilitator, everyone present. The night before, I barely slept. Not from anxiety, but from memory. Old scenes replayed themselves uninvited. Holidays where I was praised for being easy. Conversations where my discomfort was reframed as misunderstanding. I didn't push them away. I let them pass. The conference room was too bright, too clean, designed to strip emotion from the walls. My mother sat rigidly, hands clasped, eyes fixed ahead. Claire leaned close to her, whispering occasionally. Evan sat apart, posture closed, tired. The mediator spoke about goals, resolution, moving forward. Then my mother spoke. She talked about grief, about losing her husband, about how everything fell apart afterward. She said she didn't recognize her family anymore. She didn't say my name. Claire followed. She cried, quietly. She spoke about feeling abandoned, about how she never meant to hurt me, about how things just got out of hand. She did say my name. When it was my turn, I didn't stand. I stayed seated. "I'm not here to punish anyone," I said. "I'm here to stop being punished for refusing to disappear." The mediator nodded encouragingly. I continued. I didn't contest the will. I didn't attack the company. I withdrew my consent to be financially exposed without authority. That's not betrayal, that's autonomy. My mother shook her head. "You could have talked to us." "I did," I replied. "You just didn't listen until there were consequences." Silence filled the room. "I'm not asking for changes," I said calmly. "I'm asking for acknowledgement. That my role was real, that my withdrawal was reasonable, and that I am not responsible for holding this family together at my own expense." The mediator looked between us. My mother finally turned toward me. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was sharp. "So that's it," she said. "You walk away and expect us to thank you." "No," I said gently. "I expect you to stop blaming me for leaving a position you put me in without consent." Claire looked down. Evan stared at the table. The mediator cleared his throat and suggested a break. In the hallway, Evan approached me. "I didn't know how bad it was," he said quietly. I met his gaze. "That doesn't absolve you." "I know." The mediation ended without resolution. And strangely, I felt relieved. Not because nothing changed, but because nothing needed to. A week later, Denise called with an update. "They're backing down," she said. "Not publicly, but procedurally. The challenge will likely be dismissed." I closed my eyes, and emotionally I asked, "That's not something courts resolve." She was right. The final hearing came and went without spectacle. The judge dismissed the claim. The amended will stood. The trust documentation remained intact. Legally, it was over. Emotionally, it never would be. My mother didn't call. Claire sent a message that said, "I hope someday we can move past this." I didn't reply. Evan sent one that said, "I'm trying to do better." I believed him. That night, I sat alone in my office, the city quieting outside, and reviewed the final documents one last time. Everything was settled. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt complete. Revenge is loud. It demands witnesses. Resolution is quiet. It only needs truth. I locked the office and walked into the night knowing something with certainty I'd never had before. I wasn't waiting for my family to choose me anymore. I had already chosen myself, and that decision once made didn't need their permission to stand. After the court dismissed the challenge, the silence changed shape. It was no longer tense or anticipatory. It was settled, heavy in a way that suggested something had ended without ceremony. No one called to argue. No one sent dramatic messages. My mother stopped reaching out entirely. Claire's texts became infrequent, polite, distant like notes exchanged between acquaintances who once shared a past they didn't know how to reference anymore. Evan tried in his own uneven way. He sent updates about the company I hadn't asked for, hired advisors, new policies, things he wanted me to notice. I read them acknowledged when appropriate and kept my distance. I wasn't punishing him. I was protecting the boundary we had never learned how to hold. Work filled the space the family once occupied. Hale Advisory Group grew slowly, deliberately. I turned down as many clients as I accepted. If someone wanted me to smooth over dysfunction instead of naming it, I declined. One afternoon, a man in his 60s sat across from me, eyes red, voice breaking as he said, "I built something my children don't want to carry." I didn't offer comfort. I offered clarity. We talked about exit plans, about giving without control, about love that doesn't require silence. When he left, he shook my hand like it meant something. It did. That evening, I received a letter in the mail, not an email. Not a legal notice. Handwritten. My grandmother's handwriting had always been precise, elegant, slightly slanted. "Lauren, I am proud of you in a way I was never brave enough to be proud out loud before. You did what your father couldn't. You chose truth over comfort. That costs something. But it also gives that something back. I don't know how much time I have left. None of us do. But I know this: when the stories of this family are told honestly someday, you will be the one who didn't lie to herself. Keep going. Evelyn." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. 2 weeks later, she passed quietly in her sleep. The funeral was small, controlled, respectful. I went. Not for reconciliation, not for closure, for witness. My mother avoided me. Claire nodded stiffly. Evan stood beside me, briefly unsure of what to say. I stood by the grave and listened to the words, spoken about a woman who had understood power without craving it. When it was over, I didn't linger. Grief doesn't always require proximity. On the drive home, I realized something I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at my parents, not at my siblings, not even at the version of myself who had stayed too long. Anger requires hope that something could have been different. I had moved past that. One morning in early winter, I woke to sunlight slanting across my bedroom floor and the realization that my body felt calm. No bracing, no rehearsing, no scanning for danger. I had built a life where the people around me didn't need me to disappear in order to stay comfortable. That afternoon, I signed a lease for a slightly larger office. Not because I needed the space, but because I wanted room to grow without apologizing. As I walked through it, empty and echoing, I imagined conversations that hadn't happened yet, decisions made early, cracks addressed before they split foundations. I thought of my parents, of how different things might have been if someone had taught them that silence is not the same as peace. That evening, Claire sent one last message. "I'm going to therapy. I'm trying to understand my part in everything. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know." I stared at it for a long time. Then I replied, "I'm glad you're looking inward. Take care of yourself." That was all. Forgiveness isn't a gift you give to reward effort. It's something that grows when trust is rebuilt slowly, if it ever does. The year ended quietly. No grand reunion, no dramatic apology scene, just distance that felt earned rather than imposed. On New Year's Eve, I stood on my balcony watching fireworks bloom and fade across the city skyline, each one brief, bright, gone without explanation. I thought about how much energy people spend trying to preserve images instead of relationships, and how freeing it is to let the image go. As midnight passed, I didn't make a resolution. I didn't need one. I had already done the hardest thing. I had stopped asking to be included in spaces that required my silence, and in doing so, I had made room for something quieter, steadier, and far more durable than approval. A life built on choice, and that I knew was the real inheritance. After the court dismissed the challenge, the silence changed shape. It was no longer tense or anticipatory. It was settled, heavy in a way that suggested something had ended without ceremony. No one called to argue. No one sent dramatic messages. My mother stopped reaching out entirely. Claire's texts became infrequent, polite, distant, like notes exchanged between acquaintances who once shared a past they didn't know how to reference anymore. Evan tried in his own uneven way. He sent updates about the company I hadn't asked for. Hired advisors, new policies, things he wanted me to notice. I read them, acknowledged when appropriate, and kept my distance. I wasn't punishing him. I was protecting the boundary we had never learned how to hold. Work filled the space the family once occupied. Hale Advisory Group grew slowly, deliberately. I turned down as many clients as I accepted. If someone wanted me to smooth over dysfunction instead of naming it, I declined. One afternoon, a man in his 60s sat across from me, eyes red, voice breaking as he said, "I built something my children don't want to carry." I didn't offer comfort. I offered clarity. We talked about exit plans, about giving without control, about love that doesn't require silence. When he left, he shook my hand like it meant something. It did. That evening, I received a letter in the mail. Not an email, not a legal notice. Handwritten. My grandmother's handwriting had always been precise, elegant, slightly slanted. "Lauren, I am proud of you in a way I was never brave enough to be proud out loud before. You did what your father couldn't. You chose truth over comfort. That costs something, but it also gives something back. I don't know how much time I have left. None of us do. But I know this, when the stories of this family are told honestly, someday you will be the one who didn't lie to herself. Keep going. Evelyn." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. 2 weeks later, she passed quietly in her sleep. The funeral was small, controlled, respectful. I went. Not for reconciliation, not for closure. For witness, my mother avoided me. Claire nodded stiffly. Evan stood beside me briefly, unsure of what to say. I stood by the grave and listened to the words spoken about a woman who had understood power without craving it. When it was over, I didn't linger. Grief doesn't always require proximity. On the drive home, I realized something I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at my parents, not at my siblings, not even at the version of myself who had stayed too long. Anger requires hope that something could have been different. I had moved past that. One morning in early winter, I woke to sunlight slanting across my bedroom floor and the realization that my body felt calm. No bracing, no rehearsing, no scanning for danger. I had built a life where the people around me didn't need me to disappear in order to stay comfortable. That afternoon, I signed a lease for a slightly larger office. Not because I needed the space, but because I wanted room to grow without apologizing. As I walked through it, empty and echoing, I imagined conversations that hadn't happened yet. Decisions made early, cracks addressed before they split foundations. I thought of my parents, of how different things might have been if someone had taught them that silence is not the same as peace. That evening, Claire sent one last message. "I'm going to therapy. I'm trying to understand my part in everything. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know." I stared at it for a long time. Then I replied, "I'm glad you're looking inward. Take care of yourself." That was all. Forgiveness isn't a gift you give to reward effort. It's something that grows when trust is rebuilt slowly. If it ever does. The year ended quietly. No grand reunion, no dramatic apology scene. Just distance that felt earned rather than imposed. On New Year's Eve, I stood on my balcony watching fireworks bloom and fade across the city skyline. Each one brief, bright, gone without explanation. I thought about how much energy people spend trying to preserve images instead of relationships, and how freeing it is to let the image go. As midnight passed, I didn't make a resolution. I didn't need one. I had already done the hardest thing. I had stopped asking to be included in spaces that required my silence. And in doing so, I had made room for something quieter, steadier, and far more durable than approval. A life built on choice, and that I knew was the real inheritance. The moment I knew the story was truly over didn't come with a phone call or a document. It came on an ordinary morning months later when I realized I hadn't thought about my family at all the day before. Not once. I noticed it while standing in line at a coffee shop. The smell of burnt espresso and sugar thick in the air. The low hum of strangers talking about nothing important. I reached for my wallet, paid, and stepped aside without that familiar tightening in my chest. No bracing, no rehearsing conversations, no quiet inventory of who might need something from me next. Just presence. That was when it hit me. Freedom doesn't arrive loudly. It slips in unnoticed, then stays. Hale Advisory Group was no longer new. It had weight, structure, a rhythm. My calendar filled with people who came to me before things exploded, not after. Founders trying to avoid repeating their parents' mistakes. Adult children trying to exit businesses without tearing families apart. Women who had spent decades being the reliable one and were finally asking what reliability had cost them. I never advertised revenge. I offered clarity. One afternoon, a client asked me, "How did you know when to stop trying to fix them?" I didn't answer right away. Because I said finally, I realized they weren't broken. They were comfortable. Comfortable with imbalance, comfortable with silence, comfortable letting one person carry the weight so everyone else could pretend things were fine. That's not something you fix. That's something you step away from. I still heard about my family occasionally, through distant connections, through social noise. Evan was stabilizing the company. Slower growth, fewer risks, more oversight. Claire had moved to another city, new job, new circle. My mother kept her world small and predictable. None of it pulled at me anymore. Distance had done what confrontation never could. It had returned my energy to me. On the anniversary of my father's death, I visited the cemetery alone. I didn't bring flowers. I didn't speak out loud. I stood there quietly, hands in my coat pockets, and let the moment pass without trying to extract meaning from it. I understood him better now. His fear, his compromises, his quiet preparations. Understanding, however, is not the same as excusing, and I no longer needed either. That evening, I sat at my desk and reread my grandmother's letter. The paper had softened from being unfolded too many times. Her words hadn't lost their edge. You chose truth over comfort. That choice had cost me a family structure that only worked if I stayed small. It had cost me approval, access, familiar roles. What it gave me instead was something far rarer: agency. I decided where my time went, who had access to me, what problems were mine to solve and which ones were not. I had stopped being the silent guarantor of other people's lives. That winter, I was invited to speak on a panel about succession planning. Someone in the audience asked, "What's the biggest mistake families make?" I answered without hesitation. They confuse love with control and loyalty with silence. A murmur rippled through the room. Love doesn't require self-erasure, I continued, and loyalty that costs you your dignity isn't loyalty. It's fear. When the panel ended, a woman about my mother's age approached me. Her eyes were wet but steady. "I wish I had heard that 30 years ago," she said. I nodded. It's never too late to stop paying for peace with yourself. That night, walking home under streetlights that cast long, forgiving shadows, I thought about revenge. Real revenge, I had learned, doesn't look like destruction. It looks like detachment. It looks like watching people face the consequences of choices you quietly refuse to keep absorbing. It looks like a life that no longer revolves around proving anything. The last message I ever received from my mother came months later. One sentence. "I hope you're happy." I read it. I didn't analyze it. I didn't reply. I was. Not because everything turned out perfectly, but because I stopped participating in systems that required my silence to function. If you're listening to this and something in your chest feels tight, if you recognize yourself as the one who smooths things over, the one who signs quietly, the one who carries risk, so others can stay comfortable, hear this clearly. You are not selfish for stepping back. You are not cruel for choosing yourself, and you are not obligated to stay where your value is only recognized when you're useful. Sometimes the most powerful form of revenge is simple. You leave. You document the truth. You build something that doesn't need their permission. And you let the silence speak for itself. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on where you might be overgiving, overfunctioning, or disappearing to keep the peace. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if stories like this matter to you, consider liking and subscribing. Some truths take time to surface, but once they do, you never unsee them, and you never go back.